welcome to this special episode of Coffee with Coker. And we have a podcast veteran back with us today, Taylor Harrison. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
And we just wanted to jump in real quick because as we're recording this, it is the 2 days after the State of the Union speech that President Trump delivered early February of 2019. And there were a number of things that we thought was interesting and we wanted to address even just briefly, specifically as it relates to discussion around the healthcare industry, healthcare policy agendas, and some of the things that could be coming down the pipe here as far as Washington goes on healthcare. So, Taylor, maybe just kind of take it away and think about as far as what the president said in the speech. You know, where do some of these things? What were some of the highlights of the things that were tied to the healthcare industry? And you know, what are your thoughts on maybe what we can expect for anything to come out of this here in the future?
Sure. So I think there was a lot said on healthcare in general as far as reducing costs across the board. I mean, he talked about everything from drug costs to costs within the hospitals to price transparency. And we heard that, reiterated from Stacey Abrams as well. She brought up an anecdote about her father and the need to decrease healthcare costs. So I think that we saw that. And I think what this shows is, I think we can all say there were very few moments of bipartisan support during the State of the Union, but those moments, a lot of them were on the healthcare agenda. I mean, I think that we've seen this before. We understand it. We've said this to our clients for years. This is something that has always had bipartisan support. We of course need to lower healthcare costs. When you look at the state of the United States and where we compare on a cost basis to our other industrialized nations, we have widely more expensive healthcare costs. And the question has been, how do we decrease that? And so I think the main thing that we want to focus on today in the way that we feel like it impacts our clients the most is the call for price transparency.
Yeah, that's definitely been a reoccurring theme. Like you said, if we think about this is probably the largest domestic policy agenda right now as far as Washington goes. And as is always, to your point, as it's always very important, specifically price transparency. I guess it's getting more specific at this point. We're not just talking about, hey, we need to increase quality and reduce costs. There has to be a functional way, actionable way to do that to make it meaningful for the industry itself. So maybe walk us through key takeaways as it relates to specifically price transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I mean, price transparency is something that's not new to the industry. We've been calling for it for years. Patients have been calling for it. Payers have been calling for it. CMS has been calling for it across the board. People want to see larger transparency in what they're actually paying for. I mean, as far as industries go, this is, again, one of the largest, if not the largest industry in the United States. And it is one of the very, very few where we have no idea what the cost of our goods sold are. So price transparency is key. And I think that we talk a lot about one of the main trends in healthcare right now is the push towards consumer-driven healthcare. Patients are becoming vastly more informed about their healthcare and where they're getting it delivered. So as we look at this, we understand that, again, our administration is calling for it from both sides of the aisle, but so are the patients. And, anecdotally, our healthcare insurance, I know, does this, and I think a lot of people's do now, is you can go online and you can look up, okay, if I have to get an MRI, what's the cost getting it at this hospital versus this imaging center, things like that. And, is it cheaper? And what is my out-of-pocket cost going to be? And things like that. So again, this is not just the government. This is, every facet of this industry. So I think there were three key takeaways, at least that I had, as far as what can our clients and what can organizations do to prepare and to respond to this demand for price transparency. And the first one is, strengthening IT infrastructure. So I think we talk about this a lot, but one of the main issues with being able to be transparent about pricing is that there's no current way for them to be able to do it. I mean, there's so many organizations do not have the infrastructure in place to actually monitor their costs on a procedure basis. They can look at overarching expenses, but to break it down to this cost is associated to this procedure or this physician is virtually impossible in a lot of organizations. So I think that's the first first action that people need to look into is how can we improve our IT infrastructure. And we'll talk about this later in my third point. But, again, when we look at things like value-based reimbursement, this is also crucial.
Right.
If people can't, determine how much they're spending, they have no way to know if they're going to be successful in these models.
That's right.
So the next one is to continue to look at alternative ways than just inpatient care settings. So we're talking about ASCs. We're talking about these outpatient centers that hospitals can either build themselves or partner with community practices to build or, invest in, things like that. So, we've seen over and over again, everyone's aware of this. Having a procedure done in an ASC is incredibly less expensive than having it done inpatient. And so as we continue to look at these prices, and again, as patients become more aware of this, procedures that can be done easily in an ASC setting are going to continue to make that push. And we've seen this in inpatient use rate trends. Even as our population is aging and you would expect our inpatient use rates to continue to climb, that's not what's happening. What we're seeing is, even with all of that, we're continuing to see our inpatient use rates decline. And part of that has to do with, I think that we're trying to be better about having patients manage their care so that they're not ending up in the hospital. But a lot of that is also to do with people choosing to go in an outpatient setting to get their care done.
Yeah, and that's an interesting too. It's a great point because there are other kind of policy initiatives and kind of government action that influences this as well. So when we hear things like price transparency coming from the president in the State of the Union, and to your point, with all the bipartisan support behind the concept, but then we also deal with, and we talked about this in a previous podcast, the neutral site payment reductions that have gone into effect or have been proposed and are likely to go into effect, where the price disparities and the significant differences between a hospital-owned outpatient versus a physician-owned outpatient, and really trying to create some sort of or greater equilibrium between the quality and demand from the consumers and the price, meaning the reimbursement associated with those things. I think that's a good example of how we're trying to find some sort of common ground here and to make something like price transparency really something meaningful today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of off the subject, but we see this a lot with strategic planning with our health systems is, one of the things I feel like that comes up a lot is that people want better facilities, and they say, we need to remodel, we need to build a whole new inpatient floor. Well, maybe that's not your best use of your capital. I mean, at this point, your best use may be to go build, more outpatient things, or to increase your infrastructure with your primary care providers, things like that.
Partner with the physicians in the community. Absolutely.
Exactly. So I think that, again, that's a little off subject, but I think it's just all fits into this topic.
Yeah.
So the last one is, and we just want to emphasize that this doesn't necessarily all mean a challenge for our healthcare organizations. I mean, of course, it comes with its own challenges, but there are opportunities to capitalize on this. And then if you've spent the money and you've built this infrastructure, you can now leverage this to participate in these value-based reimbursement models. So again, I mean, price transparency is important for our patients, but it's really important for our organizations to understand what they're spending as well. One, the minute you start making your physicians aware that their care and the way they're providing care is monitored in some way in the level of costs. Of course, we are not saying at any point that they need to reduce costs to a concerning extent or to not give care that's needed. But sometimes we do things like run an extra MRI because we can't find the paperwork, or, run a test because, we feel like it's needed, but maybe it wasn't. Things like that, those are crucial. And that's going to be where we have a lot of cost savings. And if physicians are held to that price transparency just as much as the organizations, that's where we're going to see real improvement. And again, that's where you're going to see success in value-based reimbursement. When we think about things like a bundled payment or a shared savings, the only way that a hospital is going to be successful is to, one, know how much they're currently spending, and B, know how much they're spending going forward on a per procedure basis. We've built, or we've tried to help build bundled payments, in certain healthcare facilities. But if Our clients don't have any way to monitor that going forward. They have no idea if the bundled payment they've entered into is successful for their organization or if they would be better off continuing to do fee for service.
Which, by the way, also ties back to your first point as far as the technology, but specifically on the data, not just IT infrastructure, but on data as well, because that's critical in order to make value-based reimbursement work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, all of this price transparency all ties back into value-based reimbursement, and everything we've said ties back into it. But like you said, I mean, IT is crucial and extremely important in making these work.
Yeah. I think these are really meaningful things, not just because they were in the State of the Union speech, which means different things to different people. But I think these are interesting because these are not only relevant takeaways for our clients, but they're actionable things. They're things that we can be moving on, that our clients can be moving on literally starting today, if they're not already doing it, in order to move towards, and it doesn't just have to be moved towards greater price transparency, but continuing to move with kind of where things are going from a policy standpoint, from a regulatory landscape perspective, and even down the road from a legal compliance perspective. And I know that, that's one of the things we have a team that works specifically on value-based reimbursement initiatives. I don't know if you want to mention that real quick.
Sure, yeah. So what Mark's referring to is our Value Path service line, and we do a lot of work preparing organizations to participate in value-based reimbursement. And again, like we said, it all ties together. It ties with that price transparency. So we look at things like strategic planning and how we set up the infrastructure to support this, and running financial analytics and looking at different networks and software solutions and a whole variety of things that tie into this. Mm-hmm. And we've said this. We say this a lot to our clients. Value-based care is coming, and I think that gets lost in translation. We don't necessarily mean that all of a sudden tomorrow you're going to wake up and your payers are going to be demanding that you participate in these really extreme value-based models. That's not necessarily what we're saying. There's a lot of markets where that is slim to none at this point. But what we do say is that it's coming because our patients are going to demand it. And in time, this will be something that is kind of restructuring the way we think about care. And it's not necessarily all to do with, the volume anymore. Yeah. It has to do with the value of care and the cost of care in a lot of ways too. So, again, we say it's imminent, it's coming. And what we can do now is, again, we always caution going out and trying to participate in a ton of value-based reimbursement models if your market isn't calling for that. Mm-hmm. We would never suggest that. But what we do suggest is to do some things to prepare now for the future. And again, we look at a lot of government programs. We look at MACRA and MIPS, and again, Trump administration slowed some of these, but some of these bundled payments that CMS had in force. And again, these things still have bipartisan support, and I still think we're going to see it in the future. And what we encourage more than anything is to take inventory of where your organization stands now and to start making maybe those baby steps towards being able to participate, so that down the line you're not in a lot of trouble because you haven't done anything.
And you're not having to play catch up at the last minute. Yeah. No, well, this has been extremely helpful, and I appreciate you covering these things, particularly because there is a lot going on, and it's hard to keep up with. Even if it is coming out of the State of the Union speech, again, there's just so much else going on that it can be kind of a challenge. So we definitely want to stay on top of these things. I'm sure we'll be talking plenty more about them in the future, but thanks for this update, and we'll look forward to talking about it more.
Yeah, absolutely.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know, and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter @Coker Group. And then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.